Antonio Brisson walked outside that Tuesday morning and stopped dead. Flatbed after flatbed. Green and yellow John Deere tractors, strapped down in rows, stretching so far down the parish road he couldn't see where the convoy ended. He counted. 38 tractors. 38. His phone buzzed. The dealer, Greg Thibodeau, voice bright, proud, completely oblivious. Mr. Brisson, convoys on Parish Road 14 right now. Financing went through at $158,000 a month. Sir, I have to say this is a historic day. Antonio ended the call. He stood in the gravel and did the math a farmer does fast. 38 tractors, $15 million, his son's signature. No conversation. $158,000. Every month, rain or flood. For 10 years. He thought about 1988. About $9,200. About a handwritten note in a cedar chest his son had never seen. He called Greg back. "Stop the convoy," he said quietly. "Not one tire touches my property." Then he turned his back on $15 million worth of brand new equipment and walked toward the shed where his son was waiting. What happened next would either save Brisson Farms or end it. Antonio Brisson walked outside that Tuesday morning and stopped dead. Flatbed after flatbed. Green and yellow John Deere tractors strapped down in rows, stretching so far down the parish road he couldn't see where the convoy ended. He counted. 38 tractors. 38. His phone buzzed. The dealer, Greg Thibodeau, voice bright, proud, completely oblivious. Mr. Brisson, convoys on Parish Road 14 right now. Financing went through at $158,000 a month. Sir, I have to say, this is a historic day. Antonio ended the call. He stood in the gravel and did the math a farmer does fast. 38 tractors. $15 million, his son's signature. No conversation. $158,000. Every month. Rain or flood. For 10 years. He thought about 1988, about $9,200, about a handwritten note in a cedar chest his son had never seen. He called Greg back. "Stop the convoy," he said quietly. "Not one tire touches my property." Then he turned his back on $15 million worth of brand new equipment and walked toward the shed where his son was waiting. The shed door was already open. Marco was at the workbench with his back turned, running a socket wrench across a planter fitting that didn't need fixing. He'd heard the trucks. He knew. Antonio stepped inside and let the silence do the first work. Marco set the wrench down slowly and turned around. 34 years old, broad across the shoulders the way Brisson men always were, with his mother's jaw and his grandfather's eyes, steady, certain, already prepared to defend himself. Antonio recognized the posture. He'd worn it himself once, a long time ago, in front of a different man. "You saw them," Marco said. "Not a question." "I saw them." "Then you know why I did it." Marco reached for the laptop on the shelf beside him. 14 months of careful thinking loaded into a spreadsheet. "Let me show you the—" "Close it." Marco closed the laptop. Antonio stood in the center of the shed the way he always stood when something was already decided. Weight back, arms loose, eyes moving slowly across 44 years of tools hanging on the walls. "How long?" Antonio asked. 8 months of research. "The numbers work, Dad." 8 months, Antonio nodded once. "And in 8 months you never once came to me. Because I knew what you'd say. So instead of having a conversation, you signed my farm's name to $15 million. The word 15 landed in the shed like something dropped from a height. Marco didn't flinch. "The fleet is dying, 312,000 in repairs last year, 22 breakdowns. We lost planting windows twice. I know what it cost us." "Then you know we can't keep running on equipment that's held together with—" "I know a lot of things," Antonio said quietly. "And tonight, so will you." He walked out of the shed and back toward the house. Toward a cedar chest in the back bedroom he hadn't opened in 18 years. Behind him the convoy sat on the parish road, engines cooling, going nowhere. Marco followed him out. That was the thing about his son. He never let a conversation end before he was ready for it to end. Antonio heard the shed door swing and the gravel crunch behind him and stopped walking. He turned around slowly. Marco had the laptop open already, screen catching the morning light, and there was something in the way he carried it. Not aggressive, not defiant, but deliberate, that made Antonio realize this wasn't an impulse. This wasn't a young man who'd made a reckless decision. This was a young man who'd made a plan. That made it worse. 8 months, Marco said again, setting the laptop on the hood of the nearest truck. I want you to see what 8 months looks like. Antonio didn't move, but he didn't walk away either. Marco pulled up the first sheet. Fleet maintenance records going back 5 years, color-coded, organized by machine and by incident. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment and refused to let emotion get in the way of the argument. Fleet average age, 18 years. Last year alone we spent $312,000 on repairs and parts. Not upgrades, not improvements, just keeping old machines alive. He scrawled. 22 breakdowns that stopped field operations for more than 4 hours. Twice we lost optimal planting windows. You remember the spring before last? When the 8320 threw a hydraulic line during rice planting and we waited 9 days for parts? Antonio remembered. That single breakdown cost us $41,000 in lost yield. One breakdown. Marco pulled up the next sheet, aerial photography, side by side. This is Fontenote's operation. Same acreage as us, 3 parishes over. New fleet, precision guidance, variable rate technology. His output per acre last year was almost double ours on comparable fields. The numbers were real. Antonio knew they were real. He'd seen enough harvests, read enough reports, driven past enough neighboring operations to know that Marco wasn't inventing a problem. The problem existed. The problem had been existing for years. He looked at his son for a long moment. You built a case for the equipment, he said finally. Marco looked up. What? Everything you just showed me. That's a case for why we need newer equipment. You built it well. 14 months, you said. I believe you. Antonio's voice stayed level, unhurried. But you didn't build a case for the debt. You showed me what the machines cost us. You didn't show me what happens to this farm if we're carrying $15 million and the year goes wrong. Marco opened his mouth. And the year, Antonio said quietly, always has the option to go wrong. He turned back toward the house. Marco stood at the truck hood with his laptop open, the spreadsheets glowing in the morning light, certain he was right and beginning, for the first time, to wonder if that was enough. The cedar chest was in the back corner of the bedroom, beneath a window that looked out over the east fields. Antonio hadn't opened it in 18 years, but he knew exactly what was inside and exactly where to find it. Some things a man doesn't forget the location of. Some things he keeps precisely because forgetting them would cost too much. He carried the folder to the kitchen and set it on the table. It was the same table his father had built from cypress wood in 1961, the same table where his mother had signed the original deed transfer, where Antonio had sat across from his first banker at 22 years old, nervous and hungry and absolutely certain he could make something from 180 acres if someone would just give him the chance. 3 generations of decisions had been made at this table. The wood knew things the walls didn't. Marco came in from outside and sat down across from him. He'd left the laptop in the truck. Antonio noticed that and said nothing about it. He opened the folder slowly and began laying documents across the cypress wood one at a time. The way you lay out evidence when you need someone to understand not just the facts, but the weight of them. The first page was a crop summary from 1988. A parish agricultural report, the ink faded to brown at the edges. Rice yield down 61% from projection. Soybeans at 18% of budget. Antonio slid it across without a word and watched his son write it. Then the bank letter. Vermilion Savings and Loan, dated November 1988. Account 90 days delinquent. Immediate payment required to avoid acceleration of loan terms. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. Then Uncle Remy's note. A torn piece of lined paper, handwriting large and slightly unsteady, the way old men write when they want you to feel every word. Tony, $22,000. Pay me back when God lets you. R. Antonio set it down gently, the way you handle something that cost more than money. Then the ledger page. 1 column, 1 number at the bottom. $9,200. The account balance of Brisson Farms in January 1989, the month Marco was born. The kitchen was very quiet. That's what debt looks like. Antonio said, when the year goes wrong. Not a projection, not a risk column in a spreadsheet. He touched the corner of Remy's note. That piece of paper. That's what it looks like. Marco sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the documents spread in front of him and said nothing for a long time. Uncle Remy had died in 2003. Marco had known him as a quiet man who came to Sunday dinners and never talked about money. He had not known the man had once held this farm in his hands and chosen to give it back. The laptop stayed in the truck. They sat at the table for a while after that, the documents still spread between them, Uncle Remy's note sitting on top of the pile where Antonio had left it. Neither man spoke. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, somewhere down the parish road, one of the convoy trucks had cut its engine, and the silence it left behind felt deliberate, like the morning itself was waiting. Then Antonio reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his phone. Marco watched him scroll, unhurried, the way his father did everything, as if speed were a luxury a careful man couldn't afford. Antonio set the phone on the table and turned it so Marco could see the screen. It was a spreadsheet. Clean, organized, built in the same plain format Antonio had used for farm records since the early 90s. No color coding, no charts, just columns and numbers and the truth they added up to. Marco leaned forward. 6 months of early mornings were in that document. Antonio had been at the shop desk before sunrise most days since September, before Marco arrived, before the hired hands pulled in, working through auction listings and private sale postings and dealer repo inventories across 5 states. Used John Deere 7R and 8R machines, estate sales from retiring operators, repo lots from lenders who needed to move iron fast. He had tracked availability, recorded hours, noted maintenance histories where he could find them, and built a picture of what a complete fleet replacement could look like if a man was patient and paid in cash. 34 tractors. $3.5 million. Owned outright. No monthly payment. No banker with a claim on the harvest. Marco scrolled slowly, reading each line the way he'd read his own spreadsheets, looking for the weakness, the optimistic assumption, the number that didn't hold up. Antonio let him look. He'd done the same thing himself a dozen times over the past 6 months, checking his own work the way his father had taught him to check everything. The kitchen stayed quiet for a long time. Finally, Marco looked up. "These are real listings," he said. Not a question, a confirmation, the moment a man realizes the argument has shifted underneath him. "Everyone," Antonio said. "Some are already gone, but the market replenishes. Operators retire every season. Lenders repo every season. The iron is out there if you're willing to move when it appears." Marco looked back at the screen. Antonio watched his son's mind working, the same mind that had built 14 months of preparation, now running in a different direction, recalculating, rebuilding. 6 months, Marco said quietly. Not 12. We move fast, we hit the auctions hard, we don't wait for perfect. That's right. Marco set the phone down and looked at his father across the cypress table, across Uncle Remy's note, across everything the morning had laid between them. "Then we start Monday," he said. For the first time since the convoy arrived, they were facing the same direction. They left for Texas on a Monday morning, before the sun was up. Antonio drove. Marco had the laptop open on the passenger seat, auction listings pulled up, a mechanical inspection checklist he'd built himself running down the left side of the screen. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The highway was dark and the cab was warm, and there was something about the silence between them now that felt different from the silence in the equipment shed 3 weeks earlier. That silence had been a wall. This one was something closer to an understanding. The first auction was outside Beaumont. A retiring operator selling everything, land and equipment both. His kids settled in Houston, with no interest in row crops and no apologies about it. Antonio walked the line of machines slowly, while Marco crouched beside each one with a flashlight and a practiced eye, checking hydraulic fittings and transmission fluid and hour meters, and the 100 small things that tell the truth about how a machine has been treated. They bought 2 John Deere 8R tractors that morning, paid cash, loaded them on a flatbed by noon, and were back on the highway before the auction crowd had finished lunch. That was how it went, from April through September across 5 states. Arkansas on a Friday, a private sale from a farmer who was downsizing after a health scare and needed to move equipment before spring planting started somewhere else. Mississippi on a Tuesday, An estate auction where a family was liquidating 3 generations of iron and didn't know quite what they had. Tennessee on a Saturday morning, flying out at 5 a.m., and back by nightfall with a deal closed on 6 machines that Marco had found listed on a regional ag forum at 11 o'clock the night before. Marco handled the evaluations. Antonio handled the money. That division had emerged naturally, without discussion, sometime around the 3rd trip, Marco's technical mind meeting each machine on its own terms, while Antonio stood back and watched the seller, reading the particular anxiety of a man who needed to close and calculating exactly how much patience he could afford to show. Cash, they discovered, was a language every seller understood immediately and emotionally. Antonio would arrive with certified checks already written and a willingness to close within 48 hours, and again he watched the asking price soften in response. A man with financing needed time and paperwork and approval chains. A man with cash needed only a handshake. Oklahoma was the last state, late September, a repo lot outside Tulsa where a lender was moving 12 tractors fast and didn't want to run them through auction. Antonio negotiated the package price down 11% in a single conversation, and they loaded the last of them in the fading afternoon light. 34 tractors, $3.58 million, everyone paid in full. Everyone owned outright. Not a single monthly payment attached to any of them. On the drive home from Tulsa, Marco fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere past Shreveport. The laptop finally closed, and Antonio drove the rest of the way through the Louisiana dark and didn't mind the quiet at all. The rain started on a Thursday in early October and didn't stop for 6 weeks. At first it was just rain, the kind Louisiana gets in the fall, heavy and warm and familiar, the sort of weather that makes the air smell like wet clay and cut grass and doesn't particularly worry a man who has been farming this parish for 4 decades. Antonio watched it from the porch the first evening with a cup of coffee and no alarm. Rain was rain. The fields could handle rain. But this rain didn't move on. By the 2nd week, the drainage ditches were running full, and the low corners of the east fields were standing in 6 inches of water. By the 3rd week, those 6 inches had become 2 feet, and the water had stopped moving altogether, sitting flat and still and copper-colored over rice that had looked strong in August, over soybean rows that had been tracking ahead of the previous year's yield. Antonio walked the field edges every morning in his waders, and came back to the house with less to say each time. Marco tracked it in the numbers the way he tracked everything. Daily, precisely, without the comfort of denial. Yield projections revised downward in increments that felt almost merciful until they didn't. The rice harvest, when they finally got into the fields in November, came in at 38% of budget. The soybeans were worse. Standing water for that long doesn't negotiate with a crop, doesn't split the difference, doesn't leave you something to work with. The soybean harvest was as close to a total loss as made no difference to the bank. When the final numbers were in, Marco sat down at the kitchen table alone one evening with his laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold while he worked. He built the projection carefully, the way his father had taught him, without ever saying he was teaching him. Check every assumption, account for every cost. Don't let the number you want to see crowd out the number that's actually there. Revenue down $2.4 million against projection. He sat with that for a while. Then he opened a second column and typed in the number that wasn't there. The number that would have been there if the convoy had offloaded in March, if Greg Thibodeau's historic day had gone the way Marco had planned it. $158,000 a month, 10 months into the fiscal year. $1.58 million in equipment payments, on top of a $2.4 million revenue loss, on top of full operating costs that didn't pause for floods any more than loan payments did. He stared at the bottom of the column for a long time. They would have been $1.6 million short before a single hired hand was paid, or a single input invoice was settled. Brisson Farms would have been farming that year entirely for the bank. Every acre, every harvest, every hour, and it still wouldn't have been enough. He closed the laptop and looked out the kitchen window at the dark fields and said nothing to anyone. He didn't need to. The far field was the oldest part of the property, the original 180 acres Antonio's father had left him. The piece of ground the family had held through every bad year and every good one. The land that had been Brisson land before Marco was born, and before Antonio was born, and before the parish road had even been paved. Antonio went there sometimes when he needed to think without interruption, walking the edges with a soil probe and a quietness that the rest of the farm didn't always allow. Marco found him there on a gray November morning. The sky the color of old tin, the fields still carrying the waterline marks from the flood like a scar that hadn't fully faded. Antonio was crouched at the edge of a row, working the probe into the soil with the patience of a man who has done the same thing 1,000 times and still finds it worth doing carefully. He heard the truck, but didn't turn around. Marco parked on the field road and walked out to where his father was working. The ground was soft underfoot, still saturated, and his boots left deep prints in the mud with each step. He stopped a few feet away and stood there for a moment, looking out across the damaged fields, before he said anything. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and without any of the certainty that had been in it back in March, back in the equipment shed with the laptop open and 14 months of preparation behind him. "I would have lost everything you built," he said. "Not we, I." The word carried its full weight, and he didn't try to soften it. Antonio stayed crouched for a moment longer, working the probe one final time, reading the soil the way he'd been reading it since his 20s. Then he straightened slowly, the way men his age straighten, carefully, with full awareness of what the body has given and what it has kept, and turned to look at his son. Marco's face was open in a way Antonio hadn't seen since he was a boy. The confidence was still there underneath, but the certainty was gone, and what had replaced it was something more valuable than certainty had ever been. It was understanding, the kind that doesn't come from research or projection or 14 months of careful preparation, the kind that only comes from watching a year arrive and do what years can do. Antonio put his hand on his son's shoulder. He didn't speak for a long moment. The gray morning sat around them, quiet and unhurried, the kind of Louisiana November that smells like wet earth and wood smoke and the end of something. "You didn't," he said finally, "because you let me stop you." Marco looked at him. "That's not weakness," Antonio said. "That's the job." They stood together in the old field for a while after that, father and son saying nothing more, which was exactly enough. The paperwork was simple, the way Antonio had always preferred things to be. A family LLC, filed with the parish clerk on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, Marco Brisson listed as managing member, Antonio retaining a small ownership percentage for retirement income, and no other reason than that a man who has farmed the same land for 44 years deserves to keep his name on it for as long as he wants to. They signed at the kitchen table. The cypress wood, the same table, the same morning light coming through the window over the east fields. Antonio slid the documents across and watched his son sign them, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized had been unsettled. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than that. The particular piece of a thing completed, not finished, because the farm would never be finished, but completed in the way a man completes his portion of a long task and sets it down, knowing it will be carried forward by someone capable of carrying it. Before he left the kitchen, he went to the back bedroom and came back with the cedar chest folder, the same one he'd laid across this table 2 years earlier, Uncle Remy's note on top, the bank letter underneath, the 1988 crop summary going soft at the folds. He set it in front of Marco without ceremony. "Don't throw it away," he said. That was all. Marco didn't ask why. He already knew why. By summer, Marco was speaking at agricultural extension meetings across the parish, and by fall, he had been invited to present at the annual Louisiana Farm Bureau Conference in Baton Rouge. Standing in front of rows of young operators, many of them the same age he'd been when he'd signed a delivery order he had no authority to sign, and telling them what almost happened to Brisson Farms and what his father had known that his models hadn't accounted for. He always brought the folder. He never read from it. He just set it on the podium where people could see it and let it sit there while he talked. because a worn manila folder with soft creases and faded ink communicates something that a presentation slide cannot. Dustin Arsenault came by the farm on a Wednesday evening in November, pulling into the driveway in a truck that had the particular quietness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. He farmed 3,200 acres, 2 parishes over, had financed $13 million in equipment in 2021, and was 4 months behind on payments. The bank had called twice that week. He sat down at the kitchen table and Marco put the folder in front of him and went through it page by page. The crop summary, the bank letter, the ledger page, Uncle Remy's note, the same way Antonio had done it 2 years before, with the same unhurried patience, letting the documents do the talking. Dustin sat with his hands flat on the table and didn't say anything for a long time. Some lessons arrive early enough to change the ending. Some arrive just in time. Antonio had made sure his son received his early enough. Marco was trying to do the same for anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. The story of the 38 tractors that never arrived spread the way stories spread in small parishes. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. It moved through coffee shops and feed stores and the long, patient lines at the grain elevator, passed from one operator to the next. The way useful information always travels in farming communities, by word of mouth between people who understand what the stakes actually are. It crossed parish lines by the end of 2023, and by the time Marco spoke in Baton Rouge, it had already reached people who had driven 3 hours to hear it confirmed by the man who had lived it. The 38 John Deere 7R tractors became a kind of shorthand in Vermilion Parish. A cautionary tale, yes, but more than that, a measuring stick. When a young farmer was being pressured by a dealer with attractive terms and a financing package that looked clean on paper, someone would mention Brisson Farms and the convoy that turned around on Parish Road 14, and the conversation would slow down and get more careful. That was the thing a spreadsheet couldn't model. Not the flood risk, not the market volatility, not the particular arithmetic of a bad year stacked against a fixed monthly obligation. All of that could be approximated. What couldn't be captured in a projection was the weight of a worn manila folder on a cypress table, or the specific silence of a son, realizing what his father had carried alone for 34 years so that the farm could survive long enough to be worth inheriting. Marco thought about his father every time he saw a dealer advertisement. The glossy ones with the low monthly figures printed large and the interest rate printed small, and the photographs of gleaming new iron sitting in perfect fields under perfect skies. He would think about a Tuesday morning in March 2022. A gravel driveway, a man with a phone pressed to his ear, walking away from $15 million without raising his voice. The tractors they'd bought instead, 34 of them, used, paid for, owned completely, sat in the equipment yard without impressing anyone who didn't know the story. Visitors expecting to see new iron sometimes asked about the fleet, and Marco would tell them the age and the hours and the purchase price and watch their expressions recalibrate. The machines were not impressive. They were something better than impressive. They were free. Free of monthly obligations that didn't care about flood seasons. Free of bankers with claims on the harvest. Free of the particular terror of a bad year arriving when you have no margin left to absorb it. They represented the one thing a loan agreement can never include in its terms: the freedom to survive whatever the year decides to bring, and still call the land your own when it's over. Antonio Brisson had known that since 1988. It just took 34 years, a cedar chest, and a convoy on a parish road to pass it on. And that's the story of how one decision, made in a gravel driveway on a Tuesday morning, saved everything Brisson Farms had spent 44 years becoming. But here's the question worth sitting with. How many farms, how many businesses, how many families are out there right now carrying debt that made perfect sense on paper and haven't had someone walk out of the house and stop the convoy yet? If this story made you think differently about ownership, about debt, about what it means to truly build something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. A young farmer, a first-generation business owner, Someone being handed a financing package that looks clean and moves fast. And if you want more stories like this one, real, grounded, the kind that stay with you, subscribe, hit that like button, and recommend this to someone you love. The convoy is always on its way somewhere. The question is whether you'll be ready when it pulls up to your driveway.